here to talk about why API testing failed and how I think GenAI can finally fix it. You might find the title a bit hyperbolic, like, I don't know, it's not everyone agrees that API testing failed, but I will claim that and I will show why I think that happened. So, although Kanika introduced me, I will reintroduce myself. So I'm Ido Cohen. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Loadmill. My background, I actually started my career in QA as a manual QA tester, and I later went on to be an automation developer and a developer and engineering manager. I worked at startups and large corporates that acquired them. I co-founded Loadmill, and I do a lot of other stuff with tech. I really like to reverse engineer stuff. I do some videos where I reverse engineer mobile apps and stuff like that. So I was a bit nerdy, and I love testing and tech for a really long while. So I'm here to talk about the testing pyramid in some way, because for me it was really interesting. I found out about the testing pyramid a long while ago. When I was an engineering manager, we had a lot of challenges with testing. When I looked into our testing portfolios and I looked at what was like the most effective type of testing that we were doing, I actually found that we had this sort of like service layer tests that were implemented in robot framework and like sort of like end-to-end API test. And when I researched it more, I found about the testing pyramid back then, which is a theory that I think is sort of like well regarded. Obviously, it's not right for everyone, but it makes a lot of sense to me, and a lot of smart people have agreed that this is sort of like the right way to build your testing portfolio. So the top of the pyramid, or maybe we'll start at the bottom. At the bottom of the pyramid, you have unit tests. Unit tests are usually, they're managed by the dev team. They're considered to be to be very cost effective. They're considered to be, so you want to have a very solid base, of unit testing in your testing portfolio. At the top of the pyramid, you have UI tests. And UI tests are obviously very important. And again, I'm talking about test automation here. So automated UI tests are obviously very important. There's a lot of things you want to validate. Your customers are using your front end, so you want to validate the UI. But they also tend to be more slow and costly to maintain, and they have a lot of challenges with them. And this is why that theory says that you want to have sort of like a really solid layer of service layer test. Here I coined it API test for simplicity. These tests that run through the service layer, they're more cost effective. They're sort of like a really good mix of benefits between unit testing and UI testing. And I think this theory makes sense for a lot of companies. But still, when we talked with a lot of companies and we asked them like how their testing portfolio looked like, for most of them, actually, I think it looks like a martini glass. So many of the customers we actually talked with Loadmill, and generally in my career, like we looked at the testing portfolio. Many of them were like very top heavy, like their testing portfolio. A lot of UI tests, a lot of Selenium tests. When you talk to an average company, they will tell you, yeah, we have some unit tests. Obviously, we would like to have more, but we have a lot of automation around the UI. And we have maybe very thin layer of sort of like service layer tests and API tests. And that really sort of like made me think like how it is that the theory that makes a lot of sense, a lot of smart people, I won't mention all of the names, but Martin Fowler, Mike Cohen, like all the thought leaders of the industry came up with this theory, which makes sense to a lot of people. But still, when we look at the average testing portfolio, it looks kind of like this. And it's not, it has a lot of impact, right? So when we structure our testing portfolio this way, there's a lot of pain involved, right? We have these bloated UI test suites that run really slow. The tests can be very unstable. So UI tests, obviously, it's important to validate whatever you can through the visual layer, but I know these tests, they can be pretty flaky, right? Whenever a small UI element changes, these tests can fail. When these tests are unstable, it affects how the automation is perceived in general, right? It drains our attention when you need to attend to every failure. And it's sort of like, it ends up having a lot of impact on how we think about the automation. Also, like the more we move forward in time, this is very incompatible with, the modern architecture. So we're talking about microservices, which is already a thing. And a lot of customers moved into microservices. UI testing, the focus on automated UI testing makes less sense when you're doing the microservice architecture. And if we move even forward, so like think about what's going to happen next, like agentic sort of like style of software is even less compatible with UI testing, right? This is going to be chatbots and a lot of different workflow, NMCP, and all these technologies. And again, if we're very invested in UI testing, we're sort of like unfuture-proofing ourselves to what's going to come. So like the bottom line is like that martini glass comes with a high cost of maintenance. It has sort of like low trust and stability issues. And overall, I think it contributed to the perception of automation not being as great as we expect it to be. So, and obviously it can differ. Some companies will feel really good about their test automation, but a lot of companies feel like it didn't really have the return on the investment that they expected automation to have. So how come there's this great theory that makes a lot of sense and all the smart people agree on, and when we look at what happens in the field, we actually see the opposite. So how come and how we ended that way? So I have 3 ideas on how it happened, and I'll try to walk you through them, and I'll also talk about what I think we can do differently. So let's go through them. So I think the first thing, and I really relate to that because I started my career as a manual QA engineer, UI is what testers understand best. And the way that automation happened is sort of like a transition from our QAs going through manual testing, and we know the product, right? We used to click buttons. We used to go over regression checklists and click buttons and think in screens and buttons. And when we come to automate, we think, okay, let's have the computer do the same thing that we're doing. Let's let the computer click buttons. So like Selenium is an obvious choice, or like, all the other UI testing frameworks are an obvious choice for that. So we come from a manual background. It's like easy to think of the problem this way. And also, I think it looks great. So like when people think about test automation, they actually imagine that ghost driving the mouse and clicking the buttons. And if you want to show your manager the value, you can actually show them all the screenshots and like everything that happens through the UI. It looks really great. It's like a ghost, so like doing the testing for us. So it's really visual. It's really easy to understand. Also, when you start with it, you have like in the beginning pretty solid ROI. So like you build the first couple of tests. You build like the 5, 10 happy path tests. And you're like, you feel great about it, right? You have some automation, and it looks great. And yeah, it's actually saving some work. But when you go down that road and you have 10,000 cases, something like that, running through the UI, you start to feel the pain. And it's different. So it's the short-term ROI that you feel from the UI testing. It looks great. We think in sort of like, a visual, sort of like user-oriented way. So that is, I think, one of the core reasons. The second reason is like, even if you buy into that idea that you want to do more API and service layer testing, it's not always as easy to begin as with like, say, record and replay UI frameworks. You first need to understand like how computers talk to each other, which is in APIs and not in, in visual way. And you need to get into like how APIs are structured, like in request and response. You have to sort of like be able to do some chaining. You don't always test one API. You want to do a whole end-to-end process. That means you do one API call, then you need to extract the value from that API call. You need to pass it to the next. So the chaining is really difficult. You also, you need to think differently about the authentication and about the state management. So it's difficult, it's more difficult. Also, when you come to debug these tests, you don't have the screenshots. You actually need to process the information you're getting back from these automation tests differently. So that's another challenge. So I think, just to sum it up, I think us being manual QAs driven through automation, it's like, it's really, we don't necessarily, not everyone have that skill set of thinking in service layer and APIs. I think people are getting better in that, but that is still a challenge for many teams to find the right resources to apply to that problem. And also I think, some people misinterpreted what it means to implement the testing through the API. So, and I think actually it's really interesting because here in Australia, I think some of the flavors of service layer testing and API testing are more popular than other places around the world. So here we have Pact that I think originated here in Australia, and they're like other like Specmatic, and like I actually talked like this week with a couple of companies that people are doing like, this talk is a bit broad in the whole world, but I think here in Australia there's some more buy-in into that type of concept. But I still feel that people look at this like type of testing, and this is what API testing means for them, and it's not really giving them the same confidence that end-to-end UI testing giving them. So it's these type of tests, which are still very effective and important, they're very narrow. You test each endpoint independently. You test for contracts. You don't map your business flows into how they're operating through the API layer. You're actually doing it in a very narrow and very sort of like discrete way, like testing each endpoint independently. You're not modeling the workflows. And then when people think about these type of tests, they think about, okay, it's nice, but it's not really, I have a user starting their journey on the mobile app, and then it goes to Salesforce, and then it goes to the back office app, and it's a really complex end-to-end process, and like testing the contract independently is not the same thing. So the third point is like, I think people have perception of what it means to test through the service layer, and it's a very sort of like, for me, it's like a slightly misled perception, and it's giving them a very narrow perspective of what it is. So just to address the last point, because I think it's super important, there are two types of like sort of like service layer tests. So we don't have to think of testing through the service layer as only doing these contract type of testing, right? There's a type of test that you're basically, like I'm suggesting, you're consuming the API to validate the end-to-end behavior of the software. And there's a type of test that is actually testing the API itself in an independent way. And both of these tests, for me, fit into the service layer of the pyramid. So it doesn't necessarily that means that you only need to do contract testing. You can actually do both, and that still give you the same values that you get from end-to-end, from service layer testing. So for me, the distinction here is that if you first free yourself from the conception that testing through the service layer, API testing is individual API endpoints contract testing. And you're switching your mindset from testing the APIs to test with the APIs. So still modeling the end-to-end business process using the APIs. It doesn't mean you have to drop the first one, but you can do both. So instead of validating the APIs in isolation, you're validating the application behavior, that this is the thing that we were looking for when we're doing end-to-end testing through the UI. You don't have to be Puritan about this. You can still fall back into UI testing where it makes sense. So you can take a very complex end-to-end business process that starts with mobile, goes to SAP, goes to Salesforce, goes back to web, whatever. You model that through the API layer, but still, if you want some visual validations, you can add some visual validation. You just don't do everything through the API layer, right? Especially it makes sense like when you're doing third-party applications like SAP and Salesforce, you're not trying to validate their UI. You're trying to validate your business process that is going through Salesforce, right? So, and I trust Salesforce, they test their own UI. I want to validate my business process, so I don't necessarily have to do it through the UI, but I can fall back into that. And the idea is that you can get the same level of confidence that you had with end-to-end UI tests, but still you can have all the benefits of service layer testing. These tests will be stable, less maintenance, they will run faster. So I think one of the bigger changes for me was that the second point, the challenges of having the right skill set to implement this type of tests. This is not just conceptual thing that you need to change your mindset about. This is how do I do it, and for me this is where GenAI comes into play. So obviously, like a lot of the talks now will talk about GenAI and AI in general, and I think obviously it's a bit too hyped, but there's a lot of value that we can take from it, and if you focus on using GenAI, say, responsibly in the right areas, it doesn't necessarily feel too hyped for me. There's a lot of value that we can get. And specifically, GenAI is really good at complementing some of the missing skill set that people had around being able to create this type of test. So actually, you can use generative AI, and I will show really shortly how I think it can work, but you can model the business process across your entire system using API, and you can feed network recordings into GenAI after you process them, and you can actually get all the APIs involved in a business process, and then you can do this mapping of mapping the business process to the API layer. So that is one thing we can use at GenAI. Also, all the chaining and the authentication, all the things that were difficult with API testing and service layer testing, especially when you think about it end-to-end, GenAI is really good at helping you with that. One of the challenges that people came to with API testing is the APIs are not always well documented. And GenAI can also help you make sense of these, what are the structures of the schemas of the APIs. It can really help fill these gaps where these APIs weren't well documented. Generative AI is also can be very helpful in generating the assertions, and we have that for example in our product where the AI can suggest you schema validations and other types of assertions So it's really helpful with that. But the bottom line is for me that now GenAI really lowers the barrier of what you need to know and what you need to have in your skill set in order to implement this type of tests. And this is like one of the reasons I think like, okay, if you free yourself for the other misconception and you're only left with that gap in your skill set, now GenAI can actually help fix it. So I actually want to zoom a little bit into how I think GenAI can help fix this missing skill set. I just wanna, and I don't know if everyone here are very familiar with the topic, so I just wanted to sort of like double click on what it means to be able to take like, multiple API calls or a complex business process and map it into API calls. Some people might think you can just capture the API calls and you can replay them as is, but it doesn't always necessarily work that way in API testing. When you, for example, trigger an API call in this example to order a plane ticket, it will get a unique ID. And when you later want in the same business process to somehow like cancel that plane ticket or change it or something like that, you will need to use that dynamically created ID to sort of like to address it. And that is a thing that is usually not such a big problem with UI testing, but when you get into the API layer, it becomes a bit more complex. And AI is really good at this sort of like type of pattern matching. So you can actually feed a lot of traffic into, after you do some filtering and processing, and you can feed that into the AI, and it can help you find these what we call correlations. Another challenge is like distinguishing between what is the values in the APIs that are actually part of the user behavior and what is something that you need to sort of like maintain as system state. So a lot of these challenges can actually be addressed by using AI. I actually have here a very short demo of how the process can look like. Obviously, I will be using Loadmill to show it, and I won't push it too hard because I want to make it more sort of like a broad thing. But in this demonstration, we're actually going to take like natural textual description of a test case, and we're going to give it to an agent to play it in a mobile app. And then we're going to capture the API calls that the mobile app plays while this scenario is actually being played. And then we're going to process that into API tests. So in this demonstration, this is, for example, the scenario. It's just a very simple scenario played on the mobile app. You open the app, you click some entity, you go to notes, you create a new note. And we take these instructions and we feed them to an agent that is playing these instructions on the mobile app. This is not our automated test. This is not what we'll play time again and again. We just extract the network layer from that process while we do it. So the agent is playing the instructions on the mobile app while we're running some capturing mechanism in the background. And once we get all these API calls, and I'm fast forwarding, so the agent is playing the scenario on the mobile app. Once we play this scenario on the mobile app, we get all the API calls that were triggered by this scenario. We feed that into another sort of like AI agent, and it basically sort of like filter out all the irrelevant API calls and sort of like create a test descriptions out of it. So you can actually sort of like see all the relevant API calls that happen in that process. And the AI is basically suggesting we're going to use these API calls to actually replay that business process. And once you approve that, it will actually generate the code for you. So so once you do that, we actually generate that for you. We take the low-code approach because, again, we try to make it is something new for a lot of people. So you can actually also consume that as sort of like in low-code. There are multiple low-code platforms for this type of testing. But the idea is that we take human instructions, we play them once, either using an agent or manually. We capture the API calls. We process the API calls into an automated test script. And that used to be very difficult, and I think regardless of what we do at Loadmill, it's now something that becomes very viable to do. So if we agree that it is not as hard to do as it used to be, I'm suggesting this sort of like new default for our consideration of end-to-end testing and our testing portfolio in general. So if you take only one point from this talk, I think like just reconsider that sort of like UI test automation is the default for everything. Just think about this. It might still make sense for you that you need to test through the UI. Maybe your app is very UI logic heavy, but just rethink that, because it might be that you can benefit a lot from pushing a lot of the testing into the service layer. And then don't only think about API testing as contract testing and pact, and although you can still use it, it's very useful. But you can do service layer testing also for end-to-end testing because it gives you a lot of benefits. And then you can use generative AI. Obviously, it's not good for everything, but a lot of the tasks that we need to do here in that sort of like process that I'm suggesting, they can really be handled well with generative AI if you apply the right processes, right filtering, the right rules, and then just rethink what API testing means. So you don't get stuck with what you thought it meant in the past. That is it. So just to sum it up, I think AI can really make API testing popular by lowering the skill barrier and unlocking the better test practices, because we need to rethink our practices. Unless we're super happy with what we have right now, we need to rethink like how we got here and how we can get better. And I think the tool exists now. The tools exist now, so you can actually reconsider if you were doing the right thing so far. And so one last thing before we do questions. So I talked a lot about the testing pyramid and martini glasses. So we're going to have in our booth at 3 p.m., we're going to have a martini happy hour. And the theme is like, drink your martinis, don't use them for testing. And so we're going to have a martini happy hour, so you can come register at our booth. Apparently, Australia regulates alcohol consumption very well, so there's some registration process, but come join us. And you can scan this, and then you show us that you registered at the booth, and you'll get a voucher for a martini. And that is for my talk. Are there any questions?
Yeah, just quickly, what was the tool that you said you weren't going to speak about too much, the packet sniffing tool?
Yeah, so we're Loadmill. I didn't want to make it too salesy, so this is actually what we focus on. So we focus on sort of like this hybrid type of test where we focus on doing end-to-end testing in an API-first way. So everything that we can do through the API layer, we map that business process part into API calls. And where you still need some UI validation, you can fall back to that. And we're called Loadmill. We're upstairs in the expo hall.
So the package itself is called Loadmill?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is, yeah, okay, thank you.
Anyone who asks a question gets a martini,
Yeah, good
so more hands up. There's one. Well, you need the mic because they're recording it.
Not asking for the martini anyway.
You don't have to.
You don't have to, and you can give it to someone like me.
No, I'll have it. But anyway, you spoke about capturing the API layer, like orchestration, after kicking off some process at UI, right?
Yeah.
Now, most of these apps, like at least I work for bank, so have multi-factor authentication. It becomes a bit challenging to just run through a payment process, and then capture the API because it won't work when I replay without multi-factor authentication. Yeah. How do we solve that?
Yeah, so great question. So as I said, like authentication is one of the challenges when you're thinking about the API layer. We're actually like talking with a few of the banks here in Australia, and I think like obviously I can't give like one answer fits all here, but we're working with multiple customers. We're working like with insurance companies, we work with banks, so like we know the domain very well. There are solutions for a lot of these problems. I have to say that it's and I want to be like super honest about this. This is sort of like a conceptual idea that I think is very right, but it has to come with the right support from like the environment setup and all of that. So we've seen a lot of variations, and we know like to advise what we think is right for the customer, but some of the things like will not be magically be resolved by just capturing. But we have solutions for a lot of the problems. We ran into a lot of problems and we found a lot of solutions. So yeah, we can talk about specific case if you want.
Yeah, hi Ido. That was a great talk. So question: instead of doing some sort of record from UI, can you replay production logs?
Can I replay? Sorry.
Like, can you replay production logs? That also has series of API calls.
Yeah, great question. So I would say like when we started, I thought that replaying production logs is gonna be like the greatest thing ever, and we built that capability into the product. And the process we kind of like went through is like we show that to customers, and we can basically take production logs in case they feel they have all the required information there. And a lot of customers, we got like two answers when we have that. So we have that capability in the product. Some customers are using it, but they're not using it as heavily as I expected. And the two main reasons are this. So first, sometimes I come to a customer and they tell us, oh, it's great that you can find more test cases in production, but I have this checklist of tests, like 5,000 tests. I need to cover them. So like, it's great that my users are doing some stuff in production, but I need to first cover my checklist, and I want to work with my QA team to generate it. So we can capture from QA environment, so that is one thing. Second, so getting the production traffic is difficult for some customers, especially for QA. There are a lot of people in between us and production. And we built like filtering capabilities, so we can filter all the PII and the sensitive data and the tokens and stuff like that. But still, for some customers, they just couldn't get like the production traffic to the right level that we could work with. So just to sum it up, for me, like the idea of using production traffic is like, it's great. We can, like, because what is regression testing? It's like making sure that everything that your customers were doing yesterday is still going to work for them tomorrow after my release, right? So this is like the question. Like, I want to look at what my customers are doing and just test that this still works. So for me, it's like the greatest idea ever. But the challenges were, I would say, organizational. We already have these test cases. We need to sort of like follow up on that. And also compliance and regulation, which makes it a bit difficult. So I still see a lot of promise in that. But I think it's, and Deepak, one of our partners here in Australia, said what we're doing is like we're moving in the right direction. This, I think it's going to get more popular, but it's still not there because of regulation and build the processes that are sort of entrenched in the companies. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Thank you. I'm a little bit not sold on the idea that we do have this problem where not enough tests are going through the API layer. And it is a specialist area of testing. It has its own body of knowledge. But I'm not so sold on the idea that AI is necessary as a solution. I mean, you mentioned examples up there, and you're right. Generative AI tools, because they're good at generating text. That's the whole point. They can pattern match things from a request and put them into another request, or a response, put them into another request, and that's fine. But so could in JavaScript or in Python, turning it into a dictionary and taking a variable from a dictionary and putting it into that one. So it's a concern about over-architecting solutions and using tools that, as AI tool vendors, which also rely on large language models provided by foundation companies, as that starts to increase in cost because they want their money back, and right now they're losing money, could this trap people into a cycle of using expensive tools for relatively simple solutions?
We're not expensive?
No, I just want to say, is that a question? Like,
I'm just asking, is there a risk of that? And is that something that we mitigate?
Okay. So I'll have to say, I love generative AI. I've been doing this for quite a while. We've been doing this for since ChatGPT. It wasn't ChatGPT. It was GPT-2 and 2020. But I don't think it's like a magic solution for all of the problems. I definitely don't. And while we use generative AI for a lot of the things, we actually have other types of AI that we use in the product. People became all crazy for generative AI, but we use clustering and other stuff for pattern matching and stuff like that. So AI is very cool. It's not I don't think it's a magic bullet solution for all the problems. But what I did try to say in my talk, I'm really, for me, it's really, really puzzling why this makes a lot of sense and it didn't catch up. And I think if the barriers were the skill gap and the challenges, so for that specifically, you can implement a lot of these concepts by yourself without, generative AI. But if the problem is that, you think it was inefficient to do it so far, or you didn't have the right team to do it, or I don't know, a lot of the other excuses, generative AI is very effective in solving this. So I don't want the takeaway from that talk to be now, without generative AI that wasn't possible, because I think people were thinking this is possible 20 years ago, but still it didn't happen. So if these were your excuses, I think generative AI can be very helpful with that. But it's not that, not everything just, hangs on generative AI here. It's just, now it became so much more viable than it was before. And that's sort of my take on that.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate the answer.
Hey, thanks, man. It's a wonderful presentation. I had seen that, like, as an AI, it is capturing the API from the UI layer. Yeah, it's pretty much easy. It's like you can capture all the APIs from the network layer. How about the orchestration of APIs from a user journey point of view?
How's the orchestration of?
The APIs. So the chaining of APIs. So that is where we are struggling to do the API test design. So how this tool will tackle that?
Yeah. Okay, so obviously, like, I wouldn't be able to answer, like, a lot of the deeper questions in, like, very short answer. But I will say that we took a few approaches. So in the demo I just showed, we actually captured through the UI, but you can capture through the backend, and there are, like, other ways to capture. This is, like, the most visual way to present it is, the agent clicking the buttons, and, we capture through the UI. What we actually found is, like, especially when you're talking about microservices testing and where it gets very heavy on the APIs and you have a lot of, a lot of services involved. And this is a bit of a topic by itself, but I actually opted for black box testing of these systems more into than white box testing. So instead of, like, having all the APIs that you have in systems sort of, like, tested individually, we actually sort of, like, bunch together multiple services, and usually we interact with them through, like, the gateway. So the API calls will be more similar to how the user journey looks like, like the API calls being sent from the UI. And if you have the right environment to support it, and that's also a very big discussion by its own, basically what will happen is it will trickle down to the downstream services, and it will trigger the internal APIs, but you won't be triggering from the test itself. And it might have been a bit of a complex answer to someone not very familiar with this, but it's like if you understand this, I can expand more about this later. But the idea is that this type of black boxing approach, it simplifies the test by a lot. You need to think about less endpoints, and your tests look like more like the business process than the individual endpoints. So, but it's a whole topic, like what you said. It's a whole, like, complex topic by itself.
Right. Cool. Thanks for your answer.
Thank you. More questions? Lisa left the whole session in my hands, so you can keep going. Okay, if there are no other questions, then thank you for being here, and drop by at our booth for a martini. Thank you, everyone. Great talk, Ido.